You're gonna want to sit down for this one. We have some Final Fantasy XIV hot takes. We have a couple crazy ones. Prepare yourself, I warned you. Hello everyone, I am Jmulls. You have Final Fantasy XIV hot takes. I like reading and reacting to your Final Fantasy XIV hot takes. I asked for them, you provided. Oh good god did you provide. And let's get right on into this, shall we? Let's start first with @Rio63, who says, I have one for you. We have no one else but ourselves to blame for lots of problems on the game now. Players constantly crying about how difficult to play the jobs are, the dungeons being too long and boring to navigate and so on. Well, here we are now, XDD. Who knows? There may come a day when Final Fantasy XIV will switch, not Nintendo, to autoplay at some point. I wouldn't be surprised. I think to some degree, yes. It's one of those things where I don't think, either saying all the problems are the player's responsibility or result of player feedback is necessarily correct, and I also don't think that it's not entirely on the developers either. It's some kind of mix, right? Because the game has progressively changed to get to this current state, right? And I remember back in the day trying to do Aurum Vale not even that long ago, and there were just a lot of random groups you would get paired with that couldn't do it, because the people just couldn't figure out you're supposed to eat the fruit to remove your stacks. Or they would pull too much in the first room and wipe and the group would just die. If you've played Final Fantasy XIV for a few years and you remember those runs, it's not that surprising how we got to current dungeon design. Because whenever you introduced a mechanic that deviated from the established norm and required you to actually think and learn for that specific piece of content itself, some people just couldn't do it. They couldn't be asked, or for whatever reason, they just couldn't figure it out. And when you're grouping with random people, you're not exactly interested in being there for too long. Final Fantasy XIV is an MMORPG. It is a cooperative multiplayer game at the end of the day, and a lot of people are goal-oriented. They want their loot, they want their shiny thing, they want the thing that made them queue for that piece of content to begin with. They want it as fast as possible, and they want it as easy as possible. And it's when you're the developers of the game, and you're getting a lot of this feedback from people saying, hey, this is annoying, this kind of sucks, this is annoying, can we change this? Why isn't it like this? And when you get feedback like that is very loud and widespread, especially online, it makes sense that you would incorporate that feedback into future design, and we wind up at the current situation, where I would push back a little, right? Because I do agree that I think we've gotten to this overall game state in Final Fantasy XIV, partly because of player feedback over the years, but I also think it's the responsibility of the developers to be able to say no, and not always listen to Final Fantasy XIV players' feedback. And this goes with not just Final Fantasy XIV, but for pretty much every game out there. You have to be able to identify feedback that should be taken into account and feedback that should be kind of ignored or not, taken at face value. Maybe there's some, deeper issue that because of that issue's effect on the game, it leads to that particular piece of feedback. And, that can be a really hard thing to do, don't get me wrong. It's one of the hardest things I would imagine to do in game development. And I remember what they were talking about when it came to job design. And looking ahead to say the 8.0 job changes that we're kind of looking forward to. One of the things they wanted to say, hey, can you guys just have a consensus about something, please? Because it's if you all want a specific change to happen, we'll make the change. But if it's half the people want this thing and the other half want this thing, they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. I'm not overly familiar with this subject matter, but I'm pretty sure that people that are would also echo these sentiments. It's one of the reasons we've wound up and found ourselves in this 2-minute meta is because whenever things deviated from that, people complain saying, why am I the only one that's not like this? It makes my contribution to the group really awkward and difficult to balance, or difficult to just justify in comparison to someone who is on the 2-minute cooldown, because naturally when everyone has their buffs line up with each other, that's just more damage overall, especially when you need that damage. Sure, that can be a bit dependent on the fight design, but I think the overall point just stands. And because of feedback they received over the years, more and more jobs shifted to that feeling of, well, we all need to be on the 2-minute meta. And when it comes to most issues, when it comes to game design, I think the answer can be found somewhere in the middle of the spectrum instead of one extreme or the other. I don't think you want every job to simply not line up with each other or anything like that, but I also think that if every job simply lines up with each other, it can produce overall stale gameplay, especially if you play multiple different jobs. You need to have some variety. I think it's one of Final Fantasy XIV's greatest weaknesses over the years, and that is removing the fun factor or unique elements of game design when it comes to job design, all in the name and the service of job balance. Because let's be fair here, job balance is an important element, especially to an MMORPG, because when you don't have somewhat decent balance, it throws everything into just pure chaos. And you'll have flavor of the month, and you'll have people that gravitate to certain jobs, and then people that don't play those jobs will feel ostracized and looked down on because you're actively trolling, because you could just swap over to another job, and if you're at least halfway competent and play it to a decent level, you'll pump out, at least you would think you would pop out, just more damage and better performance overall. So the perspective for a lot of people is that if you're not playing a job that is utterly broken in a state of imbalance, then you're just kind of actively trolling. And like, yeah, there's a bit of nuance there, right? Like some people may just have way more skills for one job than the other, and that lack of skill could make up for a better balance, right? But the perception, especially when it comes to the player base, more often than not, is more important and is king compared to the actual reality of the situation. But I will always fall on the argument that at the end of the day, Final Fantasy XIV is a video game, and I think the priority has to be, is this fun? Is this interesting? I am also not of the opinion that I think job design across the board is just like terrible or anything, and that like every job needs to go completely back to square one and build up from there, anything like that. There's quite a few jobs in this game that I quite like playing. It's just I think a few tweaks and changes here or there could go a long way to make them more enjoyable. I think Dragoon's a good example for this. I think Life of the Dragon is kind of stale and bland, and if you gave that a little bit more love and attention to detail and make it a bit just cooler overall to hit my buttons in that window, I think that could go a long way. It's like the animations are pretty, I love the overall flow of Dragoon. Same thing with most of the tanks. I quite like tanking in Final Fantasy XIV right now. Is it perfect? No, and I think Dark Knight requires some changes, but I can still play that thing and have an enjoyable time with it. So I think to some degree, some of the problems that Final Fantasy XIV has right now are a bit overblown, but I also wouldn't call them non-problems either. It's also one of the elements, going back to more of the discussion about this hot-taken principle, right? I think one of the most important elements when it comes to giving feedback is for that feedback to be constructive, to be well thought out, not just, this thing is boring, this thing is fun, right? It's like, yeah, are those things important? Yeah, absolutely, but it's more important to be able to identify what is fun about a system, what is fun about a job, or what isn't, and being able to explain why. It leads to better discussion, which can lead to better communication and criticism that finds its way back at Square Enix, so that feedback can be taken into account. You could also just say it's not your job and not your responsibility to make the game better, but also at the end of the day, it's like, do you like this game to begin with? Because I do, and I want to see it get better, to grow, to prosper. And I think if you do like this game, and you still like this game, you would also want to see it continue to get better. And constructive feedback that is clear and specific about what is good and what isn't and why, I think that's more valuable than ever, especially when we're in this like period of the game where the future can go in any direction. And I also think it's important for Square Enix at the end of the day to be able to identify when that feedback is coming from a good place and when that feedback could potentially lead the game overall to worse design in the long run. I think overall Final Fantasy XIV, in the best and worst ways, can feel too formulaic. That can lead to predictability, which can be nice, but also can lead to a lack of surprise, and I don't think necessarily many people like that. Or that I think necessarily that it's worth it. I want to be wowed, I want to be blown away. Speaking of jobs, let's move on to Subdued. We have at Subdued Radical, who says, I don't know, I really like Summoner. I kinda ragged on it last time. Maybe I'll have to make some snazzy video about that sometime. Well, don't worry, I'm way ahead of you. Alright, look, now I know I said that I hated Summoner. I forget my exact wording, but I'm pretty sure I said something along the lines of, I would rather dry hump a cheese grater the size of the Sahara Desert than play Summoner. But Summoner's one of those jobs where I'm like, it is so close to being fun for me, but it's just not there. At the end of the day, job design and like what we find enjoyable about jobs varies on the individual, right? For me, Summoner has a lot of design that I actually do like. Visually, it's really cool and interesting. I love dragons, so I love Bahamut. Solo Bahamut's lame though. And I really like my buttons changing and doing different things over time. So the whole Ifrit, Garuda, and Titan, like eggy things you can summon, are really cool to me, and I like that flow. It's just, I need a bit more. This kind of goes back to what we were just talking about when it comes to player feedback, especially when it comes to job design. It's so subjective at the end of the day. And it's like what I find fun and interesting, someone else may find boring and dull and repetitive. And what someone else may find really fun and interesting or just relaxing, I may find really dull and just boring overall. For me, Summoner just has too few buttons. I don't need like 40 different keybinds or anything like that, but I need a little bit more than what Summoner provides right now. And I think if it had another suite of summons like Ramu, Leviathan, and Shiva, that could go a long way to making Summoner just overall more fun, and like maybe one additional core spell to cast during all those summons. I think that could go a long way for me. But like also, when it comes to job design, I'm also a firm believer that I don't think every job should be designed to appease to everyone. Different jobs should specialize in different playstyles, because you can't create one job to please everyone, but if you have a bunch of different jobs with different playstyles, then chances are a lot of people could find at least something that really speaks to them and calls out to them that they want to play more of and get better at. Some people want a more complicated job rotation, some people want a far more simplistic one. I fall somewhere in the middle there. I found Summoner to be way too simple and repetitive for my interest, while I also found pre-7.2 Black Mage to be way overly complicated and not interesting enough for me to want to play it. But I quite like 7.2 Black Mage. I love the aesthetic of Reaper, and I can only speak of Reaper, by the way, in the context of Endwalker, because I haven't really played it yet in Dawntrail. But back in Endwalker, it was one of the jobs I played the most, not necessarily because mechanically it was all that fun and interesting, but it was like okay enough, and I really liked the aesthetic. Now let's move on to the third hot take. We have at PappinBuddyCo, who says, my Final Fantasy XIV hot take, A Realm Reborn is better than Shadowbringers. I think we can at least all come to a consensus that this take is indeed hot. Some may even say spicy, some may even say boiling. Pompeii could never, I'm just saying. Okay, personally speaking, I fall on the opposite end of this spectrum, where I think Shadowbringers is better than A Realm Reborn, though I think A Realm Reborn is better than some people let on. I really like the twist that, Garlemald invaded the Waking Sands and all that, and we had to run off to a monastery. We had to bury our dead friends. We had to, find Cid. We had that entire arc. I really like the finale of the patches of A Realm Reborn, don't get me wrong. I would say that I quite enjoyed A Realm Reborn. It's what made me fall in love with Final Fantasy XIV all those years ago when I started back in Stormblood. And I remember the old trial that this game used to have where you, capped out at, level 30, 35, somewhere in there, because I remember it stopped when you got to, the Cid introduction part. And I'm like, I need to get this game, I need to play more, I need to find out what happens next. I quite like A Realm Reborn. Now, having said that, for me, Shadowbringers is one of the best stories ever told in the medium. And from top to bottom, I just really enjoyed Shadowbringers. I loved the raid as well. I loved the near raids. I might be in the majority or the minority there. It's hard to tell with the internet sometimes, but I loved the near raids a lot. I love the Eden raids. I loved Ishgard Restoration. I loved the Baja content. Shadowbringers for me was one of my, if not just flat out my favorite time with Final Fantasy XIV. But if I'm trying to take a step back and understand why someone may enjoy A Realm Reborn more, and it's maybe the reason someone would enjoy A Realm Reborn more is just the vibes of A Realm Reborn. The absolute start of the journey when we're just starting out on this adventure, and the only thing that really makes it special is the echo that we have that allows us to actually take on the various primals, which is a really cool element, and we haven't gone up the list in terms of we need to keep continually increasing the stakes and all that, right? And we felt more like a regular adventurer. And we had periods of time there that felt significant where we were on the back foot. And I really enjoyed those elements of A Realm Reborn. I will always like A Realm Reborn. But for me, one of the things that brings Shadowbringers over it, I think the overall quality of the story is better. I think the overall quality of the actual gameplay when it comes to fight design and all that is better in Shadowbringers as well. And I think A Realm Reborn can be weirdly inconsistent with its pacing, and it's even after the trim down, there's still a lot of A Realm Reborn, particularly in the patches where I'm do we really need this? Feels like a bit of a slog. Though I will say, one of my favorite moments in A Realm Reborn wasn't even with the story, it was acquiring my first Chocobo. And learning that it could customize its own little talent tree thing. I thought that was quite nice and nifty. But I'm pretty sure in every box I would just give the edge over to Shadowbringers. I prefer the world design, I prefer the zone design, I prefer the gameplay, I prefer the story, I prefer the pacing, the characters, the villains. I'll take Emmett Silk over the villains in A Realm Reborn any day of the week personally. personally. Even when it came to the patch content in Shadowbringers, it's like 5.3, dude. I prefer 5.0 over 5.3, but 5.3 was so dang good. And then the lead up to Endwalker, oh god, I was for that. Even the lead up to Shadowbringers with the patches of Stormblood, it's like some of my favorite just overall beats that this game has ever had. I was on the edge of my seat every time there was a patch when it came to Shadowbringers, like both in the lead up to it and then the lead up to Endwalker. And then that armor art reveal, that was special. Just this giant underwater Bioshock Rapture-esque city in a place you didn't expect it to, in a game you didn't expect it from. Just blew me away. But I'll always appreciate A Realm Reborn for the simple fact that it's where everything began. It's where I fell in love with Final Fantasy XIV and where that love truly bloomed and blossomed with Shadowbringers. Is it inelegant? Is there a lot of things that, like, I think a lot of people would say, bring A Realm Reborn down? Yeah, sure. Do I think the pros at the end of it all are still better? Yeah, I think I would say that. At least in regards to the cons of A Realm Reborn. The way I always kind of framed it was that I viewed A Realm Reborn to be a really good and competent RPG. I viewed Heavensward to be a Game of the Year game. I viewed Stormblood to be a Game of the Year contender. And then I viewed Shadowbringers and Endwalker to be like, these are some of my favorite experiences in the entire medium. But for the final take of the video, let's go on over to @MimiSasabe55, who says, leveling classes has always been a chore in this game, unlike WoW, but I found myself struggling much more since 7.0 to level any more classes. Hell, I boosted Dragoon, Ninja, Monk, and Machinist, not at the same time because of money. Oddly enough though, Ninja has become my main since 7.0, but I honestly couldn't get into any of those classes at low levels. And I think it's because all of them, and now Samurai too, now that I'm actively trying to level it, get stuck in a rut of like the same 8 buttons between 50 and 70 without any real changes, mostly because of level sync. And that just makes the whole thing so boring and, in my honest opinion, difficult to trudge through. I'm doing my best to avoid buying a skip for Samurai, but it's hard to not do. I would recommend everyone to not do that and just wait for 7.3, because we're supposed to, I believe, get the new Deep Dungeon where you can also level your other jobs in there. I believe you can't level in the Occult Crescent, but you will be able to my knowledge, and if I'm remembering this correctly, within the new Deep Dungeon. Still a little ways away, but yeah. I do largely agree. I think it's so great to be able to play all of my jobs on one character. I love that element of Final Fantasy XIV, but by God, do I think actively leveling them is some of the most boring stuff you can do in this game. I did it a lot back in Shadowbringers and Endwalker, and it was largely just a bunch of dungeon spamming. Or you could do things like the deep dungeons, though I didn't find that particularly enthusing. And when you got to certain level brackets, and you had like other dailies come online, or you could go to like Bosja and stuff like that. And that's all well and fine, right? But I still found it really boring, especially if you go dungeon grinding, which is like the main way to do it. You're just like, especially if you want to play all of your jobs, or at least level them all up, you're going through the same dungeons over and 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 over. You get the point? I am personally of the opinion that I think it's kind of a mistake that in Occult Crescent we can't also level our jobs. Like, let's just do it in both the Occult Crescent and the new Deep Dungeon. Like, give player variety, please. Especially when it concerns this issue. But like, job design for the most part doesn't really come online in an interesting way until rather late in the levels for a lot of these jobs. Hi, Dragoon. And if you're just stuck in this rut of like banging out content when you know how fun the end game can be, and you just got like, cool dude, I unlocked my AoE level 40. Sick. It's an easy way to get people to just check out of doing it. And when one of the strengths of this game is the ability to play a bunch of different jobs, I think one of its greatest weaknesses is the fact that leveling those jobs is really tedious and boring. And like, you can do it, but is it fun? Maybe for some people, for me, not particularly. When I could just be doing anything else. And then when we have actual methods of leveling that are pretty quick, like the Aglia spam you could do until too recently, it's just like a bit of a kidney shot when they patch that out, and it's just like, come on, man. At least the Anglia raids were pretty good, and they gave really fast XP. And I kind of meant to talk about this particular issue in a previous take in this video, but yeah, I think a big issue plaguing MMO design and overall, like, player response to a lot of actual actual content is like the war that is going on between reward-centric gameplay and experience-centric gameplay. Because when content is fun, people may not mind going a bit slower and taking it all in, but when content is dull and stale and kind of boring, people just want to get their reward and get out. They want to do it as fast and efficiently as humanly possible. And I think that is like firmly where leveling alt jobs in this game kind of lies. And this probably deserves an entire video just on that subject matter in particular. But I think there's a few ways they could go about actually making leveling alt jobs way more fun and interesting. We talked about stop limiting abilities when you level sync in this game before, but that only really applies to, like, if you're way higher level. But if you're not higher level with those jobs, it doesn't really apply. I think this game just needs more variety in the leveling content. When you're doing your MSQ, yeah, you're experiencing a great story, and you can level a job or two while you're doing it as well, because that's the intended first-time experience, right? It's really good. And then largely afterwards, it's mainly just dungeon spamming. There's a few other methods you could do, depending upon your actual level bracket, but most of the time it's going to boil down to just dungeon spamming. And I think having the new deep dungeon be another way to level is a good change when we get it. It does depend on how good that content is specifically, but it's like, I just feel as if this game needs more variety across the board when it comes to leveling all jobs. I've always been an advocate that, hey, one of the best elements of this game is the story. Why don't we just allow XP acquisition with New Game Plus? It's like, if someone wants to replay Shadowbringers for whatever reason and they want to level up another job while doing that, whether or not that's, like, efficient or whether or not that's, like, the fastest way to go about leveling or if it's one of the slowest, why not let that be an option for those who want to do it? So, like, even if they just want to replay Shadowbringers, they could just, like, log on over to a job that needs the levels and get 2 birds killed with 1 stone. I've never really seen the issue there, and I view the pros to drastically outweigh any potential cons someone could conjure up for that. It's gotten to the point where I mostly just level with the daily quests at this point, and it's like very slow, don't get me wrong, but it's like I'm not in a particular rush to level anything else, and it's a very low time commitment to get some decent XP. Maybe it would be cool if Final Fantasy XIV could do some events where they just like really up the XP across the board for like a limited time event. WoW does this all the time. And, like, does it pose its own problems? Yeah, sure. In terms of, like, making leveling more of a distraction. But, like, I think in Final Fantasy XIV, in the confines and the context of that game, it's not particularly fun and interesting, at least to me. And if there was an event where on top of the regular earrings, right, and just food buffs, you just got, like, a massive XP bonus, that'd be a decent excuse to go level up some other jobs, to try out other things. It could be interesting to see if Final Fantasy XIV tries something like that. And with that, I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. Leave a comment down below with your own hot takes that you want me to cover to react to in the future, and I may actually do so. Stay safe, have a great day. Go play some video games if you can. Leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye everybody, until we meet again.